Most people think nuclear disasters are rare. Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island. But when you look at the declassified documents, you realize something disturbing. The accidents never stopped happening. Some incidents were covered up for decades. Others happened in places no one was watching, like space. A few were so catastrophic that were never shown in TV or newspaper. The deeper we go, the darker it gets. Chernobyl, April 26, 1986. This was supposed to be a routine safety test, just checking whether the turbines could generate power during an emergency shutdown. Instead, it became the worst nuclear disaster in history. The RBMK 1000 reactor had a fatal design flaw. It became unstable at low power. That night, the operators reduced power way too much. When they tried to increase it, catastrophe struck. Power exploded to 33,000 megawatts, 10 times higher than normal. The first explosion was steam. It tore apart the 1,200-ton steel reactor lid. The second explosion was hydrogen and oxygen, which completely destroyed the building. And then the worst part began. The graphite in the reactor core started burning. It weighed about 2,000 tons and the temperature exceeded 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. For several days, the open burning reactor acted like an uncontrolled chimney, lifting radioactive material high into the atmosphere. The firefighters who arrived first on the scene had no idea what they were dealing with. Vasily Ignatenko touched pieces of graphite with his bare hands. He received a lethal dose in 90 seconds and died after 14 days. 28 firefighters and workers died within 3 months from acute radiation sickness. Their bodies were so radioactive that they were buried in lead coffins encased in concrete at Mitino Cemetery in Moscow. 350,000 people had to leave their homes forever. The exclusion zone covers 1,000 square miles. The new sarcophagus that covered the destroyed reactor cost $1.5 billion. It's designed to last until 2086. Fukushima, March 11th, 2011. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck, the fourth most powerful in recorded history. The safety systems worked perfectly, and the Fukushima plant automatically shut down. 45 minutes later, a tsunami arrived, 50 feet high. The plant was designed to withstand waves up to 20 feet. The engineers who built the plant made a fundamental mistake. They placed the emergency backup generators in the basements, and all of them were flooded. Without power, the cooling pump stopped working. Temperature in 3 reactors began to rise. Within hours, the fuel started melting. Water reacted with the zirconium cladding on the fuel rods, producing hydrogen. March 12th at 3:36 p.m., a hydrogen buildup damaged the suppression chamber. March 14th, Unit 3. March 15th, Unit 2. 3 catastrophic explosions. 154,000 people were evacuated. Some areas were closed off for 40 years. The first confirmed death of a plant worker occurred in 2018, 7 years later. It was a man who worked on cleanup. The cause was lung cancer from inhaling radioactive particles. 3 Mile Island, March 28, 1979. At 4 a.m., a pressure relief valve stuck open. Coolant began leaking, but the control panel light showed the valve was closed. The operators saw rising water levels in the pressurizer and thought there was too much water. They shut down the emergency cooling system, but in reality, the water level reading was false. It was just steam bubbles. Coolant kept leaking, and the reactor core was exposed. Half the core melted at temperatures exceeding 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. If complete meltdown had occurred, the molten fuel would have burned through the concrete containment. Hitting groundwater would have caused a steam explosion. The small release of radioactivity caused 0 deaths. Residents received a dose equivalent to 1 chest X-ray. Demon Core, 1945 to 1946. During the Manhattan Project, 2 atomic bombs were dropped. One on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki. The USA planned to drop a third bomb as well. They possessed a sphere of plutonium weighing approximately 6 kilograms. When Japan surrendered, the core remained at Los Alamos. Harry Daghlian is working alone in the laboratory. His task is to build layer by layer a brick neutron reflector around the plutonium core. He must do this very slowly because each brick brings the core closer to achieving critical mass. When he was building the 5th layer, the neutron monitor began signaling a warning, which indicated that the core was dangerously close to criticality. The moment Daghlian tries to pull back the last brick, his hand slips. The brick falls directly onto the plutonium core and a blue flash strikes Daghlian in the face. He immediately throws off the brick with his bare hands, thereby saving the laboratory. After a few days, he begins vomiting and the skin on the hand with which he touched the brick becomes red. Later, swelling appears on his entire arm. 25 days later, he dies from radiation sickness. Louis Slotin was known for his self-confidence bordering on arrogance. He conducted the most dangerous experiment at Los Alamos called tickling the dragon's tail. Slotin had a special protocol he was supposed to follow. Between the two metal halves, special spacers were to be inserted so they could never close completely. Unfortunately, Slotin didn't follow this and held the upper half with one hand. The lower one lay on the material in the middle. The only thing that separated them was the blade of a flat screwdriver in his other hand. By turning it, he decided how close together these parts were. During the operation, the screwdriver suddenly slipped from Slotin's hand. The upper half fell onto the lower one. A huge blue flash, brighter than the sun, flooded the room. He suddenly felt a wave of heat and a metallic taste appeared in his mouth. In half a second, Slotin received 1,000 rads of neutrons and 114 rads of gamma radiation. The next day, vomiting begins, and then diarrhea. The skin on his left hand dies, and then his left arm looks like it's burned in the 3rd degree, although he never even touched fire. 9 days later, he dies. Mayak, September 29th, 1957. The USSR hid this for 20 years. The Mayak facility produced plutonium for Soviet atomic bombs. High-level radioactive waste was stored in tanks. Tank number 14 contained 80 tons of waste. At some point, the cooling system failed, and nobody noticed for a year. Temperature kept rising, and the nitrates in the solution began crystallizing. On September 29th, the temperature hit 660 degrees Fahrenheit. The concrete lid of the tank, about 160 tons of concrete, shot up like a champagne cork. 20 million curies of radioactivity spewed into the atmosphere. Fortunately, that's only 10 to 20% of what Chernobyl released, but it was all concentrated in a much smaller area. The radioactive cloud was called the East Ural Radioactive Trace. It swept through the Urals, leaving behind a trail of contamination 185 miles long and 25 miles wide. Windscale fire, October 10th, 1957. In the last century, Great Britain desperately tried to catch up with the USA and USSR in the nuclear race. The reactors at Windscale produced plutonium for British atomic bombs. Graphite in the reactor accumulated energy, and they needed to release it in a controlled manner. On October 10th, they made the attempt. Temperature rose faster than predicted, and 11 tons of uranium fuel caught fire. The fire spread, and temperature reached 2,370 degrees Fahrenheit. Only one solution remained: water. This was extremely risky because water on superheated uranium could cause a hydrogen explosion. They had no choice. For 3 days, they flooded the burning reactor. Fortunately, there was no explosion, but iodine-131 and other isotopes escaped into the atmosphere. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan ordered the report censored because he feared the reaction from others. The full report wasn't published for 30 years. Tokaimura, September 30th, 1999. Japan was a highly advanced country. It was the world's 3rd largest economy, but even there, something unbelievable happened. JCO Company was processing nuclear fuel for reactors. Workers were instructed to use proper containers and carefully dose small amounts. Instead of proper containers, the workers used buckets and worked with large batches. When 3 workers were manually mixing enriched uranium solution in a stainless steel bucket, suddenly a blue flash filled the room. It was Cherenkov radiation. Instantly, they achieved critical mass. An uncontrolled chain reaction started. The neutron alarm went off throughout the facility. Hisashi Uchi was standing closest, and in a fraction of a second, he received 17 sieverts. The lethal dose is 5 sieverts. His DNA was literally destroyed. Chromosomes shattered into fragments, and cells stopped dividing. Doctors desperately tried to save him with skin grafts, blood transfusions, and stem cell transplants. Nothing worked, and his body dissolved from the inside. Fluids poured out of every opening in his body. He survived 83 days, crying blood. Masao Shinohara received 10 sieverts, double the lethal dose. He survived 7 months in agony. Yutaka Yokokawa was farthest away. He received 3 sieverts. He survived, but with severe damage throughout his body. People within 1,150 feet were evacuated. The chain reaction lasted 20 hours before they managed to stop it by flooding the tank with a neutron-absorbing solution. Church Rock, July 16th, 1979. 3 months after 3 Mile Island, the media was occupied, so almost nobody heard about the largest radioactive waste spill in US history. United Nuclear Corporation operated a uranium mine in New Mexico. Waste was stored behind a dam. As it turned out later, the dam was faulty from the very beginning, until finally, on July 16th, it ruptured. 1,100 tons of radioactive waste and 94 million gallons of contaminated water flowed into the Puerco River. That's 357 million liters. It flowed through Navajo Nation land for 80 miles into Arizona. The Navajo used the river for everything: drinking water, bathing, watering livestock, irrigating fields. For several days, no one warned them, and when the warning finally arrived, it was too late. Long-term studies showed increased rates of cancer, kidney disease, and liver problems among the local population. The EPA was still testing the area, and it was confirmed that many areas remain contaminated to this day. Goiânia, September 1987. On September 13th, in an abandoned radiotherapy clinic in Goiânia, Brazil, 2 scrap dealers entered the ruined building looking for metal. They found a large device and sold it to a junkyard for $25. The junkyard owner, Devair Ferreira, took the device apart. Inside, he found a small capsule. He opened it and saw something inhuman, a blue powder that glowed in the dark. He thought it was something magical, so he decided to take it home. He showed it to family, neighbors, and friends. People took pieces of the glowing powder to their homes. Everything changed after a week. Suddenly, people started getting sick, vomiting, diarrhea, skin burns. Doctors had no clue what was happening. Devair Ferreira knew something was wrong with the powder. On September 28th, he took the rest of the capsule to the hospital in a plastic bag. The doctor immediately called a nuclear physicist. He arrived with a Geiger counter, and when he was in the parking lot several dozen yards in a straight line from the powder, the counter went crazy. It was cesium-137. Horror reached its peak. 249 people were contaminated. 20 required hospitalization. 4 people died. Leida das Neves, 2 junkyard workers, and Maria Gabriela Ferreira, Devair's wife. When they were burying Leida, 2,000 people protested because they didn't want a radioactive body in the cemetery. In the end, she was buried in a lead coffin inside a concrete sarcophagus. 6,000 tons of materials from homes and streets had to be buried as radioactive waste. 85 homes were partially demolished, and entire neighborhoods were contaminated. The IAEA called this one of the worst radiological incidents in the world, and this event changed international regulations regarding the securing of radioactive sources. SL1, January 3rd, 1961. At 9 p.m., 3 young men were performing maintenance on a small experimental U.S. Army reactor. They were John Burns, Richard McKinley, and Richard Legg. The task was simple. Reconnect the control rods to the drive mechanisms. The central rod needed to be pulled out 4 inches. Something unfortunately failed, and Richard Legg pulled it out 26 inches. The reactor reached criticality in 4 milliseconds. The reactor lid, weighing about 26 tons, shot up like a projectile about 9 feet high. It hit the ceiling and then fell back down with full momentum. Water and nuclear fuel were ejected under pressure. The central control rod was torn out and became a projectile. It pierced Legg through the groin, cut through his body, and pinned him to the ceiling. Burns was thrown against the wall, and metal fragments riddled his body. McKinley was farthest away, and the explosion didn't kill him instantly. After the blast, he hit his head on the control panel, and before he died, he was conscious for a few seconds. Rescue teams entered after 20 minutes. The area was so contaminated that they had to work in shifts of just a few seconds. Finding Legg on the ceiling took hours. When they brought him down, the body was so radioactive it couldn't be buried normally. These 3 men had their hands and heads cut off and buried as radioactive waste. The rest of their bodies were buried in lead coffins at a military cemetery with 5 additional tons of lead. Cosmos 954, January 24th, 1978. Cosmos 954 was launched in 1977 and contained 110 pounds of enriched uranium in a Röhrsat-type reactor. It was meant to spy on American military installations over the Arctic. Something went wrong, and the satellite spun out of control. Instead of entering a parking orbit, where it was supposed to wait hundreds of years for the radioactivity to decay, it suddenly began falling. NORAD tracked it for weeks, but still, nobody knew exactly where it would fall. On January 24th, 1978, at 6 a.m. local time, the satellite entered the atmosphere over Great Britain. Moments later, burned up over Norway and broke apart over the Arctic. Radioactive fragments fell on northern Canada in the Great Slave Lake region. Canadian and American teams searched the tundra. They found pieces within a 370-mile radius. Some were so radioactive they could be detected from a helicopter at 330 feet altitude. Palomares, January 17th, 1966, a B-52 bomber with 4 hydrogen bombs on board was performing routine mid-air refueling. It was over southern Spain at about 31,000 feet above the Mediterranean Sea. During this maneuver, it collided with a KC-135 tanker. Both aircraft exploded. 7 crew members died, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell onto Spanish territory. The first bomb falls on a dry stream bed, and the conventional explosives detonate. Plutonium scatters across 0.3 square miles. The second bomb falls on a tomato farm. Farmer Manuel Gonzalez sees the falling bomb. He survives, but his land is contaminated for centuries. The explosives detonate and plutonium scatters across 0.8 square miles. The third bomb falls on land. It didn't explode and was found intact. The fourth bomb falls into the sea. And here the biggest problem begins. It was searched for 80 days until finally fisherman Francisco Simo Orts says he saw a parachute falling into the sea and pointed out the approximate location. On April 7th, 1966, the last bomb was recovered, and fortunately it was intact. If the conventional explosives had detonated underwater, plutonium would have contaminated the Mediterranean Sea. To this day, areas around Palomares are radioactive, and Spain demands complete cleanup. K-19, July 4th, 1961. The first Soviet submarine with ballistic missiles. The crew called it Hiroshima and Widowmaker. On July 4th, in the Atlantic Ocean east of Greenland, a missile launch test was taking place. Suddenly, in the reactor compartment, temperature began rising at an alarming rate. Unfortunately, the cooling system failed. Within hours, the temperature reached 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit. and core meltdown was imminent. If that happens, a nuclear explosion underwater could occur, and the sub is armed with missiles with nuclear warheads. Captain Zateyev has no choice. Someone must enter the reactor compartment and manually build an emergency cooling system. This is literally a suicide mission. He asks for help and 8 sailors volunteer. Everyone knows they will die. They enter in shifts of a few minutes each, welding pipes and installing pumps in inhuman temperatures. The radiation is deadly for them. After a few hours, they succeed, and the reactor is fortunately cooled down. All 8 sailors died within a couple of weeks, and the USSR kept this secret for decades. The rest of the world only found out after the fall of communism. Santa Susana, 1959. 30 miles from Los Angeles, there's a place where the USA built 10 experimental nuclear reactors. Instead of water, they used liquid sodium as a coolant. Back then, they thought this was going to be the future of power generation. July 12, 1959. Operators notice a problem. Tetraline, an organic fluid used as a moderator, started leaking into the sodium coolant and blocked the flow. The temperature in the core begins to rise, and 13 out of 43 fuel elements overheat. In 1964 and 1969, 2 more partial meltdowns occurred at SRE. Fortunately, they were much smaller. Cecil Kelly, December 30th, 1958. Cecil Kelly was an experienced chemical operator at the plutonium recovery facility. December 30th, just before the end of his shift, Kelly turns on a mixer in a large tank. Unfortunately, he has no idea that plutonium has been settling at the bottom of the tank for the past few weeks. The concentration is higher than anyone thought, and a chain reaction begins instantly. A blue flash fills the room, and Kelly receives a burst of 3,000 rads, 30 grays, before losing consciousness. Kelly regains consciousness after a few minutes and has no idea what happened. After 10 hours, he falls into a coma, and doctors know the dose was too high. 35 hours after exposure, Cecil Kelly dies. Chalk River, December 12, 1952. The National Research Experimental Reactor at Chalk River was one of the most advanced research reactors in the world. December 12th, a routine test was being conducted at low power, during which an operator confused the valves. The temperature explodes and the reactor partially melts down. The water and building was seriously contaminated. Cleanup requires thousands of people, and among them is a 23-year-old US Navy officer, nuclear engineer, Jimmy Carter, the future president of the USA. Carter and his team prepare for weeks because they can only work 90 seconds per shift in the most contaminated areas. This experience shaped his views on nuclear power, which is why, as president, he was cautious but not hostile. He knew firsthand how dangerous and at the same time useful atomic energy can be. Semipalatinsk. In 1947, the Soviets chose a steppe in northeastern Kazakhstan, which they called the Polygon. The problem is that people were living in those villages. In 1949, they test the first Soviet atomic bomb. The mushroom cloud rises 6 miles high, and the wind carries it over the villages. Until 1989, they conducted a total of 456 tests. The statistics nearby were terrible. Many newborns were born without arms, with heart defects, and with cleft palates. During this time, the average life expectancy in Kazakhstan is 73 years. In the village of Goiânia, located 6 miles from the polygon, it's only 58 years. Human experiments. Plutonium injections. In 1945, Albert Stevens was misdiagnosed with stomach cancer. Dr. Joseph Hamilton injects him with 131 micrograms of plutonium without telling anyone at all what's in the syringe. This is the largest dose of plutonium ever given to a human being in history. Hamilton is 100% convinced that his patient is going to die soon. It turns out, however, that Stevens lives another 20 years from the moment of injection. Hamilton tracks him and routinely examines him, but never tells him why. The victim dies in 1966 at age 79 from heart failure, and the information only comes to light in 1993. A similar example of a nuclear test is Operation Desert Rock, which took place in 1951 in Nevada. These were military maneuvers under nuclear conditions. Soldiers in trenches were 1.2 miles from the nuclear explosion site. They were ordered to cover their eyes with their hands. At the moment of explosion, they noticed a flash through closed eyelids, and, like an X-ray, for a second they saw the bones of their own hands. By 1992, about 400,000 soldiers were exposed to nuclear explosions, and 40% of atomic veterans developed cancer. Marshall Islands, Castle Bravo. March 1st, 1954, the USA tested the hydrogen bomb. It was supposed to explode with a force of 6 megatons, but something went very wrong, and the explosion was more than twice as powerful, and at 15 megatons. This was the largest bomb the United States ever detonated. About 100 miles away lay Rongelap Atoll, where 64 people lived. 2 hours after the explosion, white powder started falling from the sky, and people didn't know what it was. It was radioactive fallout. Residents were evacuated only after 2 days, which is why everyone got acute radiation sickness. On the same day, 100 miles from Bikini, a Japanese fishing boat, Daigo Fukuryu Maru, was fishing, and there were 23 fishermen on board. At 6:45, they saw a flash on the horizon, and a few hours later, white powder started falling. They were sure it was volcanic ash, so they weren't afraid to touch it. March 14th, they returned to Yaizu port, and about 1,100 pounds of radioactive tuna went on sale in Tokyo. The next day, it turned out that everyone was seriously ill. Aikichi Kuboyama, a 40-year-old radio operator, suffered the most. He received the largest dose of radiation and died on September 23rd. He became the first nuclear victim from Japan since the detonation of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mailu-su mining town, over the river. In 1946, in Kyrgyzstan, in the valley of the Mailu-su River, the Soviets built a secret city there for uranium mining. Uranium was needed for their first atomic bombs, including Jo-1, the first Soviet nuclear bomb detonated in 1949. Until 1968, about 10,000 tons of uranium were mined there. After that, almost 2 million cubic meters of radioactive waste remained, scattered across 23 dump sites along the river. The problem is that Kyrgyzstan lies in an active seismic zone. Every few years, strong earthquakes occur there, and one of the dump sites is only 165 feet from the river, on unstable, sliding terrain. In 1958, the first major landslide occurred. About 200,000 cubic meters of contaminated soil and waste fell into the river. For 3 days, Mailu-su was yellow-green in color. The World Health Organization later measured that radon levels in the water in the Fergana Valley were 15 times higher than normal, and that's exactly where the water from this river goes. Mailu-su flows through Uzbekistan to the Fergana Valley, one of the most densely populated regions of Central Asia. About 300,000 people are directly dependent on this water for drinking and farming. In March 2002, the Davis-Besse reactor in Ohio undergoes a routine inspection. Engineers check the reactor head, where the steel casing should be at least 6 inches thick. It turns out that 96% of the thickness has been lost, and only 1/4 of an inch of steel remains. In previous years, management knew about small leaks of boric acid from the control rod drive mechanism, which at high temperatures guarantees corrosion. They postpone repairs because they know it will cost them about $25 million. David Lochbaum from the Union of Concerned Scientists said that we were 1/4 of an inch away from Chernobyl in Ohio. Stuxnet and Natanz, cyberattack at a nuclear facility. In Iran in 2010, a computer virus named Stuxnet infiltrated the control systems of the nuclear facility in Natanz. It was a weapon created by the United States and Israel, and its goal was to destroy Iran's nuclear program without harming people. The facility housed 50,000 centrifuges needed for uranium enrichment. Normally, these centrifuges spin at speeds of around 60,000 revolutions per minute. But Stuxnet changed the code and the centrifuges began to accelerate far beyond normal limits. Then they would suddenly slow down and then speed up again. The entire cycle repeated for weeks. The centrifuges began to tear themselves apart, and Iranian operators saw nothing wrong on their screens because Stuxnet was feeding them false data in real time. Satellite images from that period show something you wouldn't normally see there. Unusual vehicle movement, heightened personnel activity, and work that didn't look routine. It was obvious to the naked eye that something in Natanz had spiraled out of control. Iran never published any report explaining what really happened during those months behind the underground walls of the facility. In southern Ukraine, in Zaporizhzhia, sits Europe's largest nuclear power plant. There are 6 reactors in total, with infrastructure designed for technical failures, not for war. On March 4th, 2022, Russian forces seized the facility. From that moment on, the plant operated in an active combat zone. This is the first such situation in the history of nuclear power. In August 2022, artillery shelling occurred near the reactors. Russia blamed Ukraine and Ukraine blamed Russia. The plant lost external power, but fortunately, diesel generators automatically kicked in. This is standard protection for any nuclear power plant. The problem is that the generators have limited fuel supplies that last only a few days. Then a scenario begins that the world has already experienced once before: loss of cooling. This is exactly the mechanism that led to the Fukushima disaster. In September 2022, the International Atomic Energy Agency sent an inspection mission to Zaporizhzhia. We learned that the infrastructure was damaged and Ukrainian personnel were working under Russian supervision. Although they managed to control the emergency, in the long run, catastrophe is almost guaranteed. Kramatorsk. In 1980, a standard Soviet apartment block was built in Kramatorsk. To cut costs, they used recycled materials. Of course, no one checks the materials with a radiometer. A 1-inch cesium 137 capsule ended up in the concrete. In apartment 85 on the 3rd floor, in the wall between the bedroom and living room, the capsule was built into the concrete, 3 feet above the floor. In 1980, a family moves into apartment 85. A mother, father, and their 2 children occupy the flat. In 1981, the 18-year-old daughter dies of leukemia. In 1982, her 16-year-old brother dies of the same disease, and in 1983, their mother also dies of leukemia. Doctors could not determine the cause at the time, as the family connection suggested a possible genetic factor. A few years later, a new family moves into the apartment, unaware of its history. In 1987, their young son dies of leukemia as well. His father begins an investigation, and in 1989, a radioactive source hidden in the wall is discovered. By the time the source was found, 4 residents had died, and 17 others had been exposed to varying levels of radiation.